Hello all, thank you so much for joining us with this discussion. Just as a reminder before we get started, I would love to hear your questions. Do submit them via the app as we go. We're going to start with a few questions I've prepared, but I would love to add from the audience as we go. So to dive in, Jojo, the topic today is when the startup grows up, but it's a bit of a conundrum. I know that a lot of startups are quite short-termist, focused in terms of their execution. So how do you know when to start planning for the growing up phase and the growing terms?
Yeah, so it's a hell of a question, and it's one that we're all permanently trying to get right and redefine. I think it changes at every stage. I think the fundamental differences that startups have, even over kind of internal innovation companies, is that every 2 years we basically have to go and fundraise. So every 2 years we have to be able to show what we did with the last round of funding, and we have to show that we've essentially come on. So we have to be short-termist in a way. But as soon as you then go and fundraise, you also have to be you have to be very, very long-term. You have to be out there on the platform telling people what the industry is going to look like in 5 or 10 years' time, because the public companies can't afford to get it wrong, and of course we can. So I think that you're thinking long-term and short-term all the time. And it's quite dizzying, that kind of continual change in focal length. We spent ages trying to work out how to split the team up to be like long-term and short-term, and then we actually found out. We sort of went and asked the team, and the kind of people who join startups like that change in aperture or focal length. So we started kind of giving everyone a slightly long-term or kind of short-term set of goals. And it worked much better when we accepted that you think long-term and short-term all the time. You know, we joke, we think in kind of 5 years, and we think in terms of kind of 3 months, and then we try and be a bit hazy in between. The person who it really wasn't working for was me. So then you have to have an amazing COO, and that's the only way I found to solve it and to feel comfortable going and looking a bit further out.
Fantastic. So really about having that focus from the outset and a bit of an agile mindset,
yeah.
I guess, as you go along. And I guess, Omid, startups then, so you've got this short-term piece, you've got the long-term view, but then they run the risk on the agility front as they start to scale. How has CityMapper thought about that? How have you thought about how to stay nimble?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. First of all, thanks for having me. Hi, everybody. I would say it's probably one of the most important things for any tech company to retain that level of iteration, high pace of iteration. And by iteration, I mean essentially the cycle between learning something and then acting upon it in a consumer visible way. And it tends to be the case that startups, because they have a lower cost of coordination, have a higher pace of iteration anyway. Yeah. And then I think what follows from that is you want to preserve that as much as you can, because otherwise it's very hard to compete with people who have a lot more, I guess, employees as well as capital. So what does that really mean for us? I think you have to look at the organization. I think it goes back to some of the things that Jojo was saying, is understand what part of the organization is business as usual, and what part of the organization is what I call figure-outer. So a unit or a mission that needs to still be figured out. The business as usual part of the organization should run according to business principles that you can find somewhere else. I'll focus on the figure-outer. And the figure-outer for me is very much kind of, to give you an example, our business model, right? And how a consumer, a free app in the consumer market can make money is something we had to figure out, and we had to iterate very quickly. We became a bus company, then we became a cab company, now we're a fintech and a mobility startup. What does that mean in practice? So there are a couple of principles that we've adopted, I'd say, in the figure-outer part of the organization. One would be, first of all, hire the right people and put them into the right part of the organization. What does that mean? People in the figure-outer part of the organization would have to be happy with ambiguity, happy with change, happy with a high pace of kind of work. The second thing I would say is what you want is informal lines of command and communication. That means that there shouldn't be a middle manager that stops the flow of orders or information going from up to down. So a frontline employee should be able to give orders to the CEO, and the CEO should be able to communicate to that frontline person without too much interference. The next thing would be that, as soon as you see a blocker for pace occurring, that should be highlighted very quickly, and decision making has to be fast. And the way we think about that is if a decision is cheap or not very costly, as well as reversible, anybody should be able to make that decision. If a decision is costly and irreversible, then you want to align across the organization to make sure that everybody's aligned and things go the right way. And finally, I think this is like a little point, but it kind of exemplifies the mantra really, is should that part of the organization have weekly meetings? Well, I think it should have 7 weekly meetings if required, or 4 or 3 or 0. And it's all about focusing about not being bureaucratic or too prescriptive. It seems sometimes chaotic, but I think the chaos really helps with focusing on that pace of iteration.
And both of you have emphasized the importance of people focusing on those respective goals. And Jojo, you talked about how you've personally sort of struggled to sort of flip between. What do you need to bring to making sure that balance is maintained as CEOs? What role modeling is important, or how do you think about getting that balance and message out there always?
The absolute best thing that we did on that, and we did it 3 times because we did it badly the first 2 times, were the OKR results. So in a startup, actually like sort of similar to McKinsey in a way, you've got a bunch of people who feel huge ownership, who are kind of ready to go and run through walls with you, and sometimes that enthusiasm manifests itself in complete lack of focus. So it was really just sitting down and breaking down, okay, well, what are the 4 things that you're all building here? We did 4, we had to end the kind of tyranny of McKinsey 3s. What are the 4 things that you're achieving, and what are the kind of ways that you're achieving them? And as soon as people knew what their goals were, actually, it worked absolutely fine when we were much kind of less combobulated, as long as we knew how they all pull back together, and that eventually all of the broader goals, when you add up all the kind of minor goals, would be reached.
Like a jigsaw.
Like a jigsaw, exactly.
Fantastic.
But no one's got the picture.
And Sunil, we've talked now about staying agile, how to think about the timings.
Sure.
You're somewhat of an expert in the scaling phase. What other aspects do you think are important, or would you focus on to really making that transition?
Yeah. So in my last role, I was at Google, and that's almost the definition of scaling from a few hundred people to what it is now. And at OakNorth, we're a few hundred people deep as well. So we're kind of in that phase where we're no longer really a startup, but we're actually much bigger, and we have much larger aspirations. I think the dichotomy is knowing that everything is going to change. How do you lay the jigsaw puzzle out without knowing what the picture is? And I like the term you use, the figure-outerers. Like, who are the figure-outerers, and how do you bring it all together, knowing that everything is going to change, but not everything can change all the time. And so one of the ways that I like to think about the organization is mission, transparency, and giving everyone voice. So mission is about, as Jojo said, if you're going to get your team to run through walls, then change tact and run through a different set of walls. Everyone really needs to know why they're doing what they're doing and what we're trying to bring to the world together as a team. And that's kind of your North Star, for want of a better word. Transparency, again, just to build on both of you, is around what are your short-term goals and why do things keep changing? So I always say to the team, you can't over-communicate enough. There's actually no such thing as over-communication, because you'll often talk about stuff and you go like, I'm sure I said this yesterday, and then you have to say it again and again and again and again, all the way up and down your organization. So mission, transparency around why we're doing what we're doing, what has changed, and then voice is the most important, particularly voice of customers. So we're in a fintech like you. Yep. The voice of the customers is the single most important thing for us to keep an eye on and to keep listening to, because that's really what makes us change tact. And at a few hundred people deep, voice of our employees is really important, because they're in it day to day, whether they're in the engineering organization or they have some brilliant insight from the ML AI work, or they're out with customers and they happen to hear something from the customers. So that's, it's almost overly simplistic, but if you want to scale, and as you get into scale, just kind of pegging out the 3 points around why we're here, what's changing, and where are we at. OKRs, obviously are a great way to do it. And then making sure you're hearing from all the constituents all the time. That helps navigate this kind of the paradox of we want to get bigger, but we know everything is going to change, and kind of that, that constant conflict of you don't want to be big, but you are big type of thing.
And it has a lot of parallels, actually, to the previous session where Stephanie was talking about the power of the narrative and really focusing on communications and making sure that almost the storytelling is clear and consistent as you're navigating all of these waves. It's quite interesting when I was chatting to you guys beforehand. I know Jojo talked about sort of the waves of dealing with the scale, and you were saying about how this is the most fun phase.
Yep.
How do you make sure that that is, again, a part of that narrative and that people understand, but is there a protective role as well that you have to play with the organization?
I would say, for us, the narrative is relatively easy. When it comes to hiring, for instance, the most important thing for us is that people buy into the mission being, I think it was mentioned earlier, making cities easier to use. We all live in big cities. We're kind of familiar with the pains of it. And when we are trying to hire somebody, we want to make sure that that narrative is really understood and people buy into it. Why is that important? Because when you're navigating ambiguity, if people are aligned with the long-term goal and the narrative of the company, then it actually they don't sweat the small stuff, because the small stuff will change. The remit of a person's role will change, their title may change, the business plan may change, things will change. But if you are bought into the wider narrative and story, then you can align everybody along it, and people contribute to it very productively.
Brilliant. And that actually brings me into my next theme. Again, talent, as I said before, has been a recurring theme throughout today. And I guess it's quite an important part of having the right people to accept that narrative and roll with the punches, if you like, as you go along. Who do you hire? Who do you need to consider in building a team? Sunil, as you're thinking about scaling up, how do you think about that? Sunil.
You're looking at us. We're kind of looking at each other. So what I would say around talent, and kudos for kudos is due, I think McKinsey was the one we were talking about this before, that coined the word war on talent probably 10, 15 years ago. Very prescient, because it's clearly something all of you deal with right now, is finding the right people is probably the hardest it's ever been for every industry, regardless of your size or scale. What I'd say is, talent really starts with you knowing as an organization who you want to be and who you are, and what the values are and how the organization works. There's no kind of single cookie cutter to say, these are the kind of engineers we want, or business development folks we want, or machine learning folks. It starts with deep introspection around where do you want to take the company, what's the talent you have, where are you today, and what kind of folks are going to have the most impact in the culture that you have. So, in a larger tech firm, for example, my last life, you can have tremendous impact over a large surface area, but you will be doing smaller pieces of a large project. In our current firm, we have fewer engineers and fewer folks, so you very early in your career will have incredibly large impact on the product, but it's over a slightly smaller surface area. We are far more chaotic. We change tact every day as we talk to clients and as we find things. And there are some folks who just love that ambiguity and the freedom that it gives them. And some folks will say, you know what, actually structure gives me more freedom because I know exactly what I'm expected to do. And neither is right or wrong. So there's no pejorative commentary and one is better than the other. And as Omid, as you said, maybe you need both in the same organization, and that's okay, structured folks and unstructured folks. Yep. But it really starts with that. I think hiring is the single most important thing you will do, whether you're a startup or whether you're a large organization. So over-investing upfront in finding the right people for your culture and your business is by far the single most important thing you're going to do. And I think building a culture of hiring, building a culture of every single person that joins the organization is additive in some format, that raises the bar in some format. Kind of puts you in really good stead for the future because, title of the conference, blink and everything will change, and everything will change. So having the right talent on board that within your culture can help you grow and scale and change kind of makes hiring, as I said, the most important thing you're ever going to do. And for better or worse, the most important things are the hardest, so therefore also one of the hardest things you're going to do.
And you talked earlier about sort of hiring 10 to 15 people a week, I think the number was. How do you keep up with that pace?
It's hard. It literally, so at OakNorth at the moment, we've doubled the number of engineers we've had in the last couple of months, and we will continue that pace. And we're fortunate to be able to do that, I must say. It is one of the hardest things for us to hire 10, 15 people a week, to find the right folks, to do the interviews, to bring them on board, make them productive, make them feel part of the company. But it is the most important thing that we do.
Can I add something to that?
Course.
So I think in general, and Sunil knows this better than anybody else given his role previously at Google, but the principles of hiring are look at general cognitive ability, role-related knowledge, leadership skills, and then a culture fit, right? And if you look at those 4 dimensions, what you'll realize at some point when you're running company, at least at our pace and our size, you realize that depending on, one, the department and the role that the person's going to get, and on circumstance, you will reprioritize the importance of each of these factors, right? So I would say in general, culture fit is very important at startups that are in the early stage because things are messy and you want to make sure that people are okay with that mess. If you're a 2,000 people org, then that culture fit, you can get more mainstream quote unquote people to come along and do the work, right? It becomes less important. So depending on the stage and the circumstance, the role, you will have to readjust these factors. We again highlight mission fit as one of the most important things in the beginning, given the fact that you're still figuring a lot of things out.
Yeah, and may I add that again, because it's so important. People don't tend to sit on stage and talk about it because it's quite a fallible thing, but everything breaks all the time, every time you scale, and that's fine, right? I've seen kind of 10 to 20, 20 to 40, and you've seen kind of way, way further up the line, and everything breaks. So as a founder or as a kind of manager, it's hard not to drink your own Kool-Aid. You spend all this time talking about the future of energy and pitching to investors, but you mustn't pitch to the people you're hiring. You have to tell them, look, you're coming in and we're doubling in size again, so everything's going to break. If you don't like making things better, don't come to a startup.
Yeah.
Very good. And Jojo, I guess from Electron's point of view, you're really designing and building digital infrastructure in the energy industry. We've talked a lot about looking internally and getting it right, but obviously there must be stakeholders and regulators involved in all of that. How have you dealt with those external influences, if you like, and what are the lessons you've learned along the way?
It was a big, big learning for me as a startup that the regulator and BEIS, the Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy Department, is one of our key stakeholders. Because it's not something you expect to be dealing with so early as a startup. But we design local energy markets, and we're kind of touching technology risk of shutting down the networks, economics risk of having the wrong incentives, and the political risk of how does the transition work? Are you proving it or disproving that it's possible? So we sort of started a big dialogue with Ofgem, the energy regulator in the UK, that became a sandbox. It kind of became a point of experimentation, and they were sort of learning a lot from us, but we were learning so much about how to talk to the broader ecosystem about what we do, about what words that we assume people understood that they didn't, that really, really set us up well for then going and talking to some of the larger companies. And we really had to fight our way into, as a tech startup in the network space, into being seen as part of the ecosystem. You have people there who've been in the same network company for 40 years, and if we had to wait 40 years to be part of the ecosystem, we were going to die. So we sort of helped the regulator build a platform, helped the government build a platform, and then after a while we were like, oh my God, we're running this charity to educate the regulator and the government. Nothing's coming from it, and almost 2 years later, stuff really started to come out of it. We sort of launched the Energy Data Task Force to open up all the data we needed from a comment we'd made offhand 2 years ago, that there were all these kind of funding platforms out for what we were trying to do. So as a startup, it's really easy to be impatient about these kind of things, but it's a huge long-term investment, and you don't deserve to operate in the infrastructure space if you don't make that part of your mission and broader group, in my opinion.
Absolutely. I know, but I guess you have also been dealing with a bunch of stakeholders with CityMapper, and as a disruptor, I guess there must be lumps and bumps along the way in terms of those interactions. How do you manage fallout?
Yeah, I would say first maybe to start with a more general thought. Whenever technology, zeitgeist, policy, as well as market changes in any shape or form, I feel like there's an opportunity for innovation, right? And it usually policy lags. So when technology changes, even existing regulated spaces may actually offer up an opening. I think Uber took that to a certain extent. I think even Google and Facebook did to a certain extent with copyright and privacy respectively. So I don't think that regulated spaces in general don't offer up opportunity to innovate, as Jojo is also showing, and everybody else here as well. I don't care so much about external stakeholders, to be honest with you. As in, I think the most important stakeholders for me are my company and everybody who's part of that supply chain, as well as my customer and the consumer. Why? Because it's very hard in the current business landscape, specifically in tech, with your partners as well as your competitors, to even know the battle lines are being redrawn all the time. You don't even know how you can align. You obviously want to invest in a partnership with somebody, but it is possible that your partner is going to compete with you tomorrow. So you want to obviously invest in it as far as the partnership should be successful, but beyond that is probably futile sometimes. And with the regulator as well as the media, I feel like if you align yourself with your consumers and customers, those guys will somehow follow suit. We had an interesting case in Paris where there was debate around open data, and we got signatures from our users and said, hey, look, this is what our users want. Why are you not following in line? And lo and behold, we got a higher kind of access to open data because of it. So, and in that sense, one thing that I find is really important is alignment, frankly, when it comes to stakeholder management. When you think of, and everybody implicitly knows this, but explicitly it's interesting to visualize it, think of a person with a vector, as a vector, pointing in a direction with a certain force. And if you line up all the vectors in one specific direction, the resulting vector or the force in that direction, which hopefully is where your mission and your goals are going, is going to be enormous. And when you have an organization where the vectors are pointing into various different directions, all of a sudden you're pulling into various different kind of areas which are not necessarily aligned with where you want to head. So investing in alignment with the internal stakeholders and supply chain is actually something that, and I think you mentioned this before, Sunil, as well, is very, very important. Communicate, especially in ambiguous environments and times of change. And finally, I think with the consumer, and I think Sunil mentioned this as well, is like, it's very important to, one, respect the consumer, build a product that you feel is worthy of the consumer, and talk to them in a way where you're not talking down to them and are relatable as a company. That certainly applies to us in our space with our brand. We're a relatable brand, and that's why we'll communicate in a relatable way. And being proactive in communication when it comes to changes is really important to keep that trust.
Fantastic. I'm going to ask a few of the audience questions. Thank you for sending them in. So, this is one of my favorites that's come through so far. What was the biggest growing pain for your business as it scaled? And any of you, because I assume this applies to everyone.
The one we struggle with most, and we're continually redefining it, was trying to reorient ourselves from a company that delivered projects to a company that delivered a product.
Yeah.
And that's still going, and it looks different at every stage. The way we got around it is actually we realized that the network companies were buying projects, and the people who were then kind of using it were kind of paying for the product. So sort of merged the team, and we've got 3 people doing the product owner role from slightly different disciplines, and it's working for this stage, but it'll break again when we get to 40 or 50. And again, that's okay. We're fine with that. We just have to keep kind of asking that same question.
Fantastic. Any other particular experiences to share?
Yeah, sure.
So there's many. That's why all of us looked at each other as soon as you asked the
so
question.
many.
It's hard to stack rank them all. Given where we're at the moment, several hundred folks deep, I think it's the polarity and the paradox of things that lead you in one direction while going in the other. So if you take the word fintech, and I will answer the question in a second, but if you take the word fintech, you kind of got tech, which should be a disruptor, and a regulated market, a very heavily regulated market all over the world. So it's like, how do you balance those competing forces? I think is one of the hardest things for us. So we talk a lot about disciplined growth, which kind of sounds a bit like an oxymoron because if you're growing, you're growing. How can you be disciplined about growing? It's like disciplined fun type of statement. And I think that's the thing that we struggle with the most, is without knowing where the jigsaw puzzle is going to land, how do you plan for the long run but actually execute in the short run? How do you have a plan but know when to tear it up? How do you hire great talent that's going to scale tomorrow but is willing to do the work today? And we're in 12 different geographies around the world, so how do you do this in different geographies with different client groups, large financial institutions in our case, different regulators, the same team, without, and kind of do that in a stable way as we go, knowing that stability is not the path for a startup, growth is the path for a startup. Those are the things that we've kind of, and you see it in, it's not a strategic decision, you see it in day-to-day small decisions. Do you take more office space or less office space? Do you hire more people or less people? Do you enter market or not? So you can see the spread of decisions are actually quite vast, where you see this kind of polarity.
Mm. And Sunil, that actually tees up perfectly another one of the questions that have come through, which is OakNorth is expanding abroad. So how are you adapting your tech business model to adapt to new markets?
Sorry, could you go through the question again?
As you expand abroad, how are you adapting the tech business model to adapt to new markets?
Yep. So the simplest way to describe it is, so OakNorth is basically a credit decisioning platform that we've used to create a UK bank and that we licensed to other financial institutions in about 12 markets at the moment around the world. What we've decided is the technology platform will be uniform across the world, but our implementation is geography by geography, client by client. Partly that's driven by the nature of clients, partly by the nature of data and ML and AI. Part of it is regulatory regimes, et cetera. So we try to keep a core that is similar. From a people perspective, values and ways of operating similar, but very, very focused on the nuances of each market that we get into.
Fantastic. Unbelievably, time is already up. That has gone really fast. Thank you for the questions. Thank you so much for the responses.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.